You're standing in the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace in 1520, and the morning light filters through ornate windows, casting intricate shadows on walls that have witnessed secrets darker than the deepest dungeons of Europe. The air is thick with incense and something else, something that makes your stomach turn when you realize what you're actually seeing. Beautiful young boys, no older than 12 or 13, glide through these halls like living sculptures, their eyes holding depths of knowledge that children should never possess. Their silk robes shimmer as they move, but if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something that will haunt your dreams. These aren't just servants, these aren't just students. These are the Sultan's most prized possessions, and what happened to them behind these walls represents one of history's most systematic and carefully hidden forms of institutional abuse. The Ottoman Empire built its power on many foundations, but one of the darkest was a pipeline of children stolen from their families and transformed into something that would make even the most hardened medieval torture master recoil in horror. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of historical cruelty. This is the story of how an empire convinced itself that destroying childhood was a form of education, how beauty became a curse that condemned innocent boys to lives of unimaginable degradation, and how the most powerful empire on earth built its administrative backbone on the systematic abuse of children who had no choice, no voice, and no escape. The Devshirme system, the child tribute that fed the Ottoman war machine, has been sanitized by historians who focus on its role in creating capable administrators and elite soldiers. They'll tell you about the Janissaries, the empire's legendary military corps. They'll explain how some of these boys rose to positions of incredible power, becoming viziers and generals who shaped the destiny of nations. What they won't tell you is what happened to the ones who were deemed too beautiful for warfare, too delicate for administration, but perfect for something far more sinister. Let me paint you a picture of how this nightmare began. Every few years, Ottoman officials would sweep through Christian villages across the Balkans like human vultures, selecting the most promising boys for imperial service. But promising didn't just mean strong or intelligent. It meant beautiful. It meant vulnerable. It meant young enough to be completely molded by their captors. The officials had specific criteria: boys between 8 and 15, physically attractive, showing signs of intelligence, and most importantly, from families too poor and powerless to resist. Imagine being the father of a 12-year-old son in a Bulgarian mountain village. You've raised this boy with love and hope, teaching him to tend your small flock of sheep, showing him how to read the weather in the clouds, telling him stories of his ancestors who fought against invaders for generations. Then one morning, you hear the sound every parent in the Balkans had learned to dread: the thundering of hooves on cobblestone, the jingle of harnesses, the authoritative voices speaking in a language that spelled doom for your family. The Ottoman collectors didn't just take any children, they were connoisseurs of human beauty, experts in evaluating which boys would grow into the kind of men who could serve the empire's most intimate needs. They examined teeth like horse traders, tested reflexes, measured proportions, and assessed that indefinable quality they called refinement, a combination of physical beauty and psychological malleability that marked a child as suitable for the palace's darkest purposes. Your son stands there trembling as strange men evaluate his worth like a piece of livestock. They comment on his clear skin, his bright eyes, his delicate bone structure. They make notes in their ledgers, calculating his potential value to the empire. When they point at him and nod to each other, you know your world is about to end. But what you don't know, what you couldn't possibly imagine, is that your boy's nightmare is just beginning. The journey to Istanbul was designed to break these children before they even reached the capital. Hundreds of boys were chained together and marched across rugged terrain for weeks or months, inadequately fed, sleeping in the open, watched constantly by guards who seemed to take pleasure in their suffering. The weak ones, those who couldn't keep up, who fell ill, or who simply gave up hope were left behind to die. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculated process of selection, ensuring that only the most resilient would survive to serve the empire's needs. But survival of this journey was just the first test. Upon arrival in Istanbul, the boys faced something called the Great Selection, a process so thoroughly dehumanizing that it would make a modern human trafficking operation seem merciful by comparison. Ottoman officials divided the survivors into categories based on their perceived potential, but this wasn't just about identifying future soldiers or administrators. There was a special category, whispered about in the palace but never officially acknowledged, for boys who possessed that particular combination of beauty and vulnerability that made them suitable for the most intimate forms of imperial service. The palace school system has been praised by historians as an early form of meritocratic education, and there's some truth to that. Boys who entered this system did receive an education that was, by the standards of the time, exceptionally advanced. They learned multiple languages, studied mathematics and astronomy, mastered literature and law, and were trained in various arts and crafts. But this education came with a price that extended far beyond academic rigor. Picture walking through the dormitories where these boys were housed. The marble floors are cold beneath your feet, and the air carries the scent of rose water and something else. Something that makes your skin crawl when you realize what it is. Fear. These children lived in a state of constant terror, not just of physical punishment, but of something far worse. They were being systematically prepared for a life where their bodies would belong entirely to others, where their childhood innocence would be surgically removed along with their capacity for normal human relationships. The most beautiful boys, those deemed suitable for the Sultan's personal attention, underwent a transformation process that was as methodical as it was horrifying. They were assigned to special quarters within the palace complex, separated from the outside world by layers of walls, guards, and protocol that made escape not just difficult, but literally unthinkable. Their education took on a different character, focusing not just on intellectual accomplishments, but on the arts of personal service that no child should ever have to learn. These boys learned to walk with a particular grace, to hold their hands in certain ways, to arrange their clothing for maximum aesthetic appeal. They were taught to apply cosmetics to enhance their natural beauty, to style their hair in elaborate fashions, and to move through space in ways that would please their masters. But perhaps most disturbing of all, they were trained to suppress their own desires, emotions, and reactions, becoming living dolls programmed to respond to others' needs while their own humanity slowly died inside them. The palace operated according to a complex hierarchy where advancement depended not just on academic achievement, but on one's ability to please superiors in ways that had nothing to do with scholarship. The most successful students weren't necessarily the most intelligent. They were the ones who learned to navigate a world where their beauty was both an asset and a terrible liability, where their youth made them valuable but also completely powerless. Within this system, older students who had survived their own initiation often became the most enthusiastic enforcers of the very abuse they had once endured. They understood the rules intimately because they had been its victims, but rather than protecting newcomers, many became predators themselves. It was a twisted form of psychological survival. If you couldn't escape the system, you could at least find a place within its hierarchy where you wielded some power over those even more vulnerable than yourself. The teachers and administrators who ran this system were often former students themselves, men who had been broken by the same process and had learned to find meaning in perpetuating it. They spoke of discipline and education, of creating loyal servants of the empire. But what they had actually created was a machine designed to consume childhood innocence and produce human beings whose capacity for normal relationships had been systematically destroyed. European visitors to the Ottoman court occasionally glimpsed this hidden world, though their accounts were often filtered through their own cultural biases and limited understanding. A Venetian ambassador in the 16th century wrote of being disturbed by the excessive fondness that palace officials showed for their young male servants, describing scenes that made him profoundly uncomfortable. He noted boys as young as 10 dressed in silk and jewels, attending to older men with a familiarity that suggested relationships extending far beyond appropriate master-servant dynamics. But these foreign observers saw only the surface of something much darker. They witnessed the end result of a process that had taken years to complete. Boys who had been so thoroughly conditioned that they seemed to accept their fate willingly. What they couldn't see were the broken spirits hidden behind trained smiles, the psychological scars concealed by expensive clothing, or the systematic destruction of identity that had created these living ornaments. The physical conditions of palace life compounded the psychological abuse in ways specifically designed to break down resistance and create total dependency. These boys lived in dormitories with minimal privacy, where every moment was subject to surveillance and control. They were awakened before dawn for prayers they had been forced to learn, fed at precise times with adequate but not abundant meals, and subjected to a rigid schedule that left no time for reflection, resistance, or the development of independent thought. Punishments within this system were designed not just to inflict pain, but to humiliate and psychologically destroy. Boys who violated the countless unspoken rules faced consequences that went far beyond simple physical discipline. They might be stripped naked and forced to stand in courtyards while other students were encouraged to mock them. They could be confined in chambers barely large enough to lie down in, left in complete darkness for days with minimal food and water. Some faced public floggings that left permanent scars, but the physical wounds healed. The psychological damage was designed to last forever. The palace kept detailed records of these punishments, not out of bureaucratic necessity, but as a form of psychological warfare. Boys knew that every transgression was documented, that their failures were being cataloged and could be used against them at any moment. This created an atmosphere of constant anxiety where even the smallest mistake could result in devastating consequences. Children learn to monitor not just their actions, but their facial expressions, their posture, even their dreams, terrified that some unconscious betrayal might trigger the wrath of their masters. Within this environment, the concept of friendship became complicated and dangerous. Forming close bonds with other boys could provide emotional support, but it also created vulnerabilities that the system was designed to exploit. Palace administrators understood that isolated children were easier to control than those who found strength in companionship, so they actively worked to prevent meaningful relationships from developing. Boys who became too close might be separated without warning, sold to different parts of the empire, or simply made to disappear. Yet, despite these efforts, some friendships did form in the shadows. Boys would find ways to communicate through glances and gestures, sharing what little comfort they could during the brief moments when surveillance relaxed. They developed coded languages that allowed them to express feelings that were forbidden, to share memories of home that they were supposed to forget, and to maintain some connection to their original identities, despite the systematic efforts to erase them. These clandestine relationships became lifelines in a world designed to strip away every form of human connection. A gentle touch during a moment of despair, a whispered word of encouragement before a terrifying ordeal, the simple knowledge that someone else understood their suffering. These small acts of compassion took on enormous significance in an environment where kindness was rare and dangerous. But the palace authorities were skilled at identifying and destroying even these fragile bonds. They employed networks of informants among the students themselves, offering small privileges to boys who would report on their companions' activities. The promise of slightly better food, a warmer sleeping space, or protection from the worst abuses could turn even close friends into betrayers. This system of mutual surveillance created an atmosphere where trust became almost impossible, where every relationship was tainted by the possibility of betrayal. The boys who survived learned to compartmentalize their emotions in ways that would have impressed professional soldiers. They developed the ability to endure physical and psychological torture while maintaining the appearance of compliance and contentment. They mastered the art of crying silently, of screaming internally while their faces remained serene, of finding small spaces in their minds where they could retreat when the horror became too overwhelming. Some found escape through fantasy, creating elaborate internal worlds where they were still free, still loved, still human. Others discovered that complete emotional numbness provided a form of protection. If you couldn't feel pain, you couldn't be broken by it. A few developed split personalities, creating alternate selves that could handle the degradation while protecting some core part of their original identity. The palace physicians who treated these boys understood the psychological dimension of their suffering, but were powerless to address it meaningfully. They could heal physical wounds and treat obvious illnesses, but the deeper damage, the systematic destruction of the soul, was beyond their ability to repair. Their medical notes, discovered centuries later in Ottoman archives, provide clinical descriptions of symptoms we would now recognize as severe trauma responses. Chronic insomnia, digestive problems, nervous tremors, and what they called melancholic episodes that could last for weeks. These doctors also documented more disturbing symptoms that revealed the true nature of what was happening within the palace walls. Boys who had been subjected to repeated sexual abuse often developed physical complications that required ongoing medical attention. The physicians wrote about these injuries in euphemistic language, describing them as the result of intimate service or special duties. But the medical reality they documented tells a clear story of systematic child rape disguised as education. The economic structure of the palace created additional layers of exploitation that extended far beyond the immediate abuse. These boys represented significant financial investments. They had been captured, transported, housed, fed, educated, and trained at considerable expense. This economic reality meant that they were viewed not just as people but as valuable property that needed to generate returns on investment. Their beauty, their skills, and ultimately their bodies were commodities to be managed and exploited for maximum benefit. The palace maintained detailed financial records that tracked the costs associated with each boy's maintenance and training, alongside projections of their potential value in various roles. Boys who showed particular promise might have additional resources invested in their education, not out of kindness, but because more skilled servants commanded higher prices or provided greater utility. Those who proved disappointing might be sold to cover their maintenance costs, traded to other officials, or simply discarded when they were no longer useful. This commodification extended to every aspect of their existence. Their clothing was chosen not for comfort, but for aesthetic appeal. Their diet was regulated not just for health, but to maintain ideal physical proportions. Even their sleep schedules were managed to ensure they looked their best during important palace functions. They were living artworks, constantly sculpted and refined to meet the aesthetic preferences of their owners. The psychological impact of being treated as property rather than as human beings cannot be overstated. These boys learned that their worth was entirely dependent on others' evaluation of their usefulness. They internalized the message that they existed solely to serve, that their own needs and desires were irrelevant, that their value as people was determined by their ability to please those who owned them. This conditioning was so thorough that many never fully recovered their sense of individual worth, even if they eventually gained freedom. The graduation ceremonies that marked the end of formal palace education were elaborate affairs designed to celebrate the successful transformation of captured children into loyal imperial servants. But beneath the pomp and ceremony lay a more sinister reality. These young men were being officially recognized as having completed their dehumanization. They had survived the systematic destruction of their original identities and emerged as polished products of the Ottoman system. Those selected for the highest positions faced a particularly cruel irony. Success within this system meant perpetuating the very abuse that had destroyed their own childhoods. The most successful graduates often became administrators who oversaw the next generation of captured boys, teachers who implemented the same brutal conditioning they had endured, or officials who traveled to distant villages to select new victims. They had become living embodiments of the cycle of abuse. Their own survival depended on their willingness to inflict similar trauma on others. Yet even within this nightmare system, some boys found ways to resist that went beyond simple survival. They developed subtle forms of rebellion that allowed them to maintain some sense of agency without triggering deadly retaliation. Some became masters of psychological manipulation, learning to turn the system's own rules against itself. Others found ways to sabotage operations while maintaining their facades of compliance. A few even managed to help other boys escape or avoid the worst abuses, though such actions required enormous courage and risked horrific consequences. These acts of resistance were often invisible to outside observers, but held profound significance for those trapped within the system. A boy who managed to protect a younger student from assault, who found ways to share food with the weakest, who maintained some connection to his original culture despite official prohibition. These small victories represented the persistence of human dignity in circumstances designed to eliminate it entirely. The most remarkable aspect of these stories isn't the cruelty they reveal, but the evidence they provide of human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. Boys who should have been completely broken by their experiences sometimes found ways to preserve essential parts of themselves, to maintain hope in hopeless circumstances, and to extend compassion to others even when they received none themselves. But this resilience came at an enormous cost. Even those who survived with their humanity partially intact carried psychological scars that affected every aspect of their adult lives. Many struggled with relationships, unable to trust others or to believe they deserved love and respect. Others became consumed by rage, spending their lives seeking revenge against a system that had stolen their childhoods. Some simply withdrew from human contact entirely, finding solitude less painful than the risk of further emotional damage. The palace walls that contained this suffering still stand today, transformed into a museum where tourists admire the architectural beauty and artistic treasures of Ottoman civilization. Visitors marvel at the intricate tile work, the elegant courtyards, and the luxurious chambers where the empire's elite lived and worked. But they see only the physical beauty of these spaces, not the human suffering they contained. The rooms where education and exploitation intertwined remain silent about the price paid by generations of stolen children. The guided tours that lead thousands through these corridors each year speak of the palace school's educational innovations, its role in training capable administrators, its contribution to the empire's success. They do not mention the systematic abuse that was fundamental to its operation, the boys who died rather than submit to its demands, or the men who emerged from its halls forever changed by their experiences within its walls. As you walk through these same marble corridors today, try to imagine the footsteps that came before you. Picture a boy named Dmitri, taken from a Serbian village at age 11, who spent his first night in the palace crying silently into his pillow, while older students whispered warnings about what awaited him. Envision Alexander from Bosnia, who tried to escape during his second month, only to be dragged back and made an example of for the other boys. Think of Mikhail from Bulgaria, who learned to smile and laugh on command while his soul retreated so far inside himself that he sometimes forgot his own name. These weren't isolated cases of abuse within an otherwise benevolent system. This was the system itself, operating exactly as designed. The Ottoman Empire didn't accidentally create conditions that led to child exploitation. It deliberately constructed an institution that transformed captured children into compliant servants through methods that would horrify modern observers. The beauty of the architecture, the sophistication of the curriculum, the luxury of the accommodations, all of this served to mask and normalize what was essentially a large-scale child trafficking operation. The selection process for the Sultan's personal favorites was particularly methodical and disturbing. Boys who caught the attention of palace officials during their initial evaluation underwent additional scrutiny that focused entirely on their aesthetic appeal and psychological malleability. They were examined by specialists who evaluated not just their current appearance, but their potential for development into the kind of companions the Sultan preferred. These specialists looked for specific physical characteristics: clear skin that would remain unblemished, facial features that suggested they would grow into handsome young men, and body proportions that indicated they would develop along pleasing lines. But they also assessed psychological traits that were harder to define but crucial for their intended purposes. They wanted boys who showed signs of sensitivity and refinement, who seemed capable of learning complex social behaviors, but who also displayed the kind of gentle nature that could be shaped and controlled. The boys selected for this special attention were moved to different quarters within the palace complex, areas that were even more isolated and carefully guarded than the regular dormitories. Their education took on a distinctly different character, focusing on subjects that had nothing to do with administration or military service. They learned the intricacies of court etiquette, the proper ways to serve food and drink, the art of conversation that entertained without challenging, and dozens of other skills designed to make them perfect companions for men who wielded absolute power. But the most disturbing aspect of their education involved lessons that no child should ever receive. They were taught to anticipate the needs and desires of their masters before those needs were even expressed. They learned to read subtle signs of mood and preference, to respond to unspoken commands, and to provide comfort and companionship in ways that went far beyond normal human relationships. These lessons were conducted by older men who had once been boys in similar situations, creating a cycle of abuse that stretched back generations. The psychological techniques used to break down these boys' resistance were as sophisticated as they were cruel. They were isolated from their peers and from any source of emotional support outside their instructors. They were subjected to unpredictable rewards and punishments that made it impossible to develop coping strategies. They were taught that their previous lives had been meaningless, that their families had abandoned them, and that their only value lay in their ability to please their new masters. Perhaps most insidiously, they were gradually conditioned to believe that their situation was not just normal, but privileged. They were told that they had been chosen for honor and distinction, that their beauty and refinement marked them as special among all the boys in the palace. They were given fine clothes and jewelry, better food than their peers, and private chambers that seemed luxurious compared to the dormitories where other students slept. This psychological manipulation made it harder for them to recognize their situation as abuse and more likely to cooperate with their captors. The daily routine for these special boys was carefully structured to maximize their availability to their masters while maintaining the fiction that they were students rather than prisoners. They woke before dawn to bathe and prepare themselves, spending hours on grooming rituals that ensured they always looked perfect. They attended shortened versions of regular classes but spent most of their time in specialized training sessions that prepared them for their evening duties. These evening duties began as seemingly innocent activities, serving wine at dinner parties, providing musical entertainment, engaging in light conversation with guests. But as the boys grew older and more experienced, their responsibilities expanded to include forms of service that were never explicitly described in palace records, but were understood by everyone involved. They became living accessories for men who had unlimited power and twisted appetites, expected to be available at any hour of the day or night for whatever purposes their masters desired. The competition among palace officials for access to the most beautiful boys created an internal economy of corruption and favor trading that infected the entire system. High-ranking administrators would offer each other access to their personal favorites as gifts or bribes. Boys were loaned out for special occasions, traded temporarily between officials, and sometimes given as rewards to visiting dignitaries or successful military commanders. This commodification reached its most grotesque expression in the practice of giving boys as diplomatic gifts. When foreign ambassadors visited the Ottoman court, they might be presented with a beautiful young man as a token of the Sultan's favor and a demonstration of Ottoman wealth and power. These boys would be sent to foreign courts where they faced uncertain fates, cut off entirely from any possibility of rescue or return. The psychological damage inflicted by this system extended far beyond the immediate victims. The palace officials who participated in these practices, many of whom had once been victims themselves, developed elaborate justifications for their behavior that revealed the profound moral corruption of the entire system. They spoke of providing education and opportunity to boys who would otherwise have lived in poverty. They claimed to be offering these children a chance at advancement and success that they never could have achieved in their original circumstances. Some even convinced themselves that they were showing kindness and affection to boys who needed guidance and protection. They pointed to the luxury and comfort of palace life, the education and training the boys received, and the positions of influence some eventually achieved as evidence that the system was beneficial rather than exploitative. This self-deception allowed them to participate in systematic child abuse while maintaining their self-image as cultured, sophisticated men. The boys who survived this system carried its effects with them for the rest of their lives, regardless of whatever worldly success they might eventually achieve. Those who rose to high positions in the imperial administration often became the most ruthless enforcers of the very system that had brutalized them. They understood its psychology intimately and used that knowledge to maintain their own power while perpetuating the abuse of new generations of victims. Others channeled their trauma into different forms of cruelty, becoming notorious for their harsh treatment of subordinates or their vindictive pursuit of personal vendettas. The capacity for normal human relationships had been so thoroughly damaged in their formative years that they struggled to form genuine connections with anyone. They lived lives of emotional isolation, surrounded by luxury and power, but unable to experience the simple human pleasures of love, friendship, and trust. Even those who managed to escape the palace system through death of their masters, changes in political fortune, or rare opportunities for flight, found it difficult to rebuild normal lives. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to see themselves as objects for others' pleasure that they struggled to develop independent identities. Many became wanderers, moving from place to place in search of something they could never quite define. Others retreated into religious contemplation, hoping to find in spiritual practice the peace that had been stolen from them in childhood. The palace archives contain thousands of documents that detail the administrative aspects of this system. Records of boys acquired, training completed, assignments made, and services rendered. But these dry bureaucratic accounts reveal only the skeleton of a much more horrifying reality. Between the lines of official correspondence and financial records lies the story of systematic child abuse on a scale that defies comprehension. Modern scholars who have studied these documents often struggle to convey the full horror of what they reveal, without seeming to sensationalize or exploit the suffering they document. The temptation is to focus on the political and military achievements of the Ottoman Empire, to discuss the palace school system in terms of its contributions to imperial administration, and to treat the abuse as an unfortunate side effect of an otherwise remarkable institution. But this approach does a disservice to the thousands of boys whose lives were destroyed by this system. Their suffering was not incidental to the palace school's success. It was integral to its operation. The empire's administrative efficiency was built on the systematic destruction of human beings, who had no choice in their fate and no voice in their treatment. The political stability that allowed Ottoman civilization to flourish was purchased with the childhood innocence of boys stolen from their families and transformed into living tools for their captors' pleasure. The physical evidence of this system has largely disappeared. The special quarters where the Sultan's favorites were housed have been renovated and repurposed. The rooms where unspeakable acts occurred now display artifacts and artwork that tell sanitized stories of imperial grandeur. The very stones that witnessed centuries of systematic abuse now serve as backdrops for tourist photographs and educational exhibits that ignore the human cost of Ottoman power. But the psychological evidence lingers in ways that are harder to erase. The Ottoman Empire's decline in the 18th and 19th centuries coincided with the gradual breakdown of the Devshirme system, but the institutional culture it had created persisted long after the formal end of child tribute. The normalization of exploitation, the acceptance of absolute power over the vulnerable, and the sophisticated justifications for systematic abuse became embedded in the empire's social and political structures. When European travelers wrote about their experiences in Ottoman courts, they often described a sense of unease they couldn't quite articulate. They spoke of beautiful young men who moved with unnatural grace, whose eyes held depths that seemed impossible for their years. These observers noted conversations that stopped abruptly when certain boys entered rooms, the way powerful officials would suddenly change their demeanor in the presence of particular servants, and an atmosphere of barely concealed tension that seemed to permeate the most elegant social gatherings. What these foreigners witnessed were the end products of a system so thoroughly institutionalized that it had become invisible to those who operated within it. Yeah, the boys they saw gliding through palace corridors weren't just servants or students. They were living monuments to the empire's capacity for transforming human suffering into administrative efficiency. Every graceful gesture had been beaten into them through years of conditioning. Every perfect smile masked psychological wounds that would never fully heal. The most chilling aspect of this system wasn't its cruelty. History is full of cruel institutions. What made the Ottoman Palace School uniquely horrifying was its sophistication, its ability to disguise systematic child abuse as educational opportunity, and its success in convincing both perpetrators and victims that what was happening was not only normal but beneficial. The empire had created a machine that could take innocent children and transform them into willing participants in their own dehumanization. The boys who entered this system arrived as individuals with names, families, dreams, and identities rooted in their home communities. They left as products, carefully crafted human beings designed to serve specific functions within the imperial hierarchy. Their original selves had been systematically erased and replaced with new personalities that existed solely to please their masters. This wasn't education. It was psychological murder followed by resurrection in a form that served the empire's needs. The financial records preserved in Ottoman archives reveal the cold calculation behind every aspect of this system. Boys were evaluated like livestock, with detailed assessments of their potential value in various roles. The most beautiful commanded premium prices and received additional investment in specialized training. Those deemed less valuable were assigned to more mundane duties or sold to recover the costs of their maintenance. Every aspect of their lives was commodified, from their clothing and food to their sleeping arrangements and medical care. But perhaps the most damning evidence of the system's true nature lies in what the records don't say. There are no accounts of boys who were returned to their families, no documentation of efforts to maintain connections to their original communities, no provisions for those who might wish to leave imperial service. Once a boy entered the palace system, he disappeared from his previous life as completely as if he had died. For his family, he had died. The child they had raised was gone forever, replaced by a stranger who served foreign masters and had forgotten his own name. This systematic erasure of identity was not an accidental byproduct of imperial education. It was its primary purpose. The Ottoman Empire understood that truly loyal servants could only be created by destroying all competing loyalties. A boy who remembered his mother's face, his father's voice, or his village's customs might someday choose those memories over imperial duty. But a boy who had been convinced that his previous life was meaningless, that his family had abandoned him, and that his only value lay in serving the empire would never betray his masters because he literally had nowhere else to go. The psychological techniques used to achieve this transformation were refined over centuries of practice. New boys were isolated from their peers and subjected to a carefully calibrated combination of reward and punishment that made resistance seem futile while cooperation appeared to offer the only path to survival. They were given new names, new clothes, new languages, and new gods while being systematically punished for any sign of attachment to their original identities. The older boys who had survived this process became unwitting accomplices in the destruction of newcomers. Having internalized the system's values and learned to find meaning within its hierarchies, they often became enthusiastic enforcers of the very abuse they had endured. They taught new arrivals the unspoken rules, demonstrated the proper ways to submit to authority, and provided living examples of what successful adaptation looked like. Their participation made the system's cruelty seem natural and inevitable rather than imposed and artificial. The empire's ability to convince its victims to become willing participants in their own exploitation represents one of history's most successful examples of institutional gaslighting. Boys were taught that their suffering was education, that their abuse was privilege, and that their lost freedom was actually a form of advancement. They were surrounded by luxury and told they were fortunate, given fine clothes and informed they were special, provided with sophisticated training and assured that they were being prepared for greatness. This psychological manipulation was so thorough that many victims never fully recognized the reality of their situation. They lived their entire lives believing that they had been rescued from poverty and ignorance, elevated to positions of importance and influence, rewarded for their beauty and intelligence. The possibility that they had been stolen, abused, and systematically broken was so threatening to their constructed identities that they actively resisted any suggestion that their experiences constituted victimization. The empire's success in creating this alternate reality for its victims had profound implications that extended far beyond the palace walls. Boys who graduated from this system carried its values and methods into every level of Ottoman society. They became governors who saw their subjects as resources to be exploited, generals who viewed soldiers as expendable tools, and administrators who treated human beings as entries in ledgers. The systematic dehumanization they had experienced became the template for how they understood all power relationships. This cultural contamination helps explain why the Ottoman Empire, despite its military prowess and administrative sophistication, ultimately proved incapable of adapting to changing historical circumstances. A civilization built on the systematic destruction of human agency and individual worth could not generate the innovation, creativity, and voluntary cooperation necessary for long-term survival in an increasingly competitive world. The empire's strength became its weakness. The same system that had created efficient administrators and loyal soldiers had also eliminated the human qualities necessary for genuine progress. The boys whose lives were consumed by this machine deserve to be remembered not as footnotes in histories of imperial grandeur, but as individuals who suffered and died so that others could live in luxury. Their names are lost, their stories untold, their graves unmarked. But their suffering was real, their pain was genuine, and their humanity was worth preserving even when the most powerful empire on earth decided it was expendable. Today, as we walk through the museums that once housed this systematic abuse, we owe it to these forgotten victims to see beyond the beautiful architecture and priceless artifacts to the human cost that made such luxury possible. Every marble column was built with wealth extracted from conquered peoples. Every golden ornament was crafted by artisans whose children might be stolen at any moment. Every silk tapestry was woven with threads of human suffering that the empire's historians chose to ignore. The palace walls still echo with the voices of boys who cried for mothers they would never see again, who dreamed of homes they had been taught to forget, who died inside long before their bodies gave up the pretense of life. Their ghosts demand that we remember not just what happened within these walls, but why it was allowed to happen. How an entire civilization convinced itself that beauty justified brutality, that education excused exploitation, and that imperial glory was worth any price in human suffering. The silence that fills these corridors today is deafening when you understand what it conceals. We've sanitized this history, packaged it into neat academic discussions about administrative efficiency and cultural exchange. But we've forgotten the most important truth, that behind every great empire's achievements lies a foundation built on the bones of the innocent. The Ottoman system didn't end because someone suddenly developed a conscience. It ended because it became economically and politically unsustainable. As European military technology advanced and new forms of governance emerged, the empire could no longer afford to waste human resources on maintaining elaborate systems of abuse. The same boys who might once have been groomed for the Sultan's pleasure were redirected toward more practical purposes, but not out of mercy, only out of necessity. When the Devshirme system finally collapsed in the 17th century, thousands of boys who had been processed through its machinery were left in a kind of limbo. They were no longer children, but they had never been allowed to become fully human adults. Many wandered the empire's fading territories carrying skills that were no longer valued and psychological scars that would never heal. Some found refuge in religious orders, others in the criminal underworld, but most simply disappeared into history's shadows, their stories untold and their suffering unacknowledged. The empire's official records from this period speak of restructuring and modernization, but they never mention what happened to the human beings who had been shaped by the old system. Boys who had spent their entire lives learning to please masters who no longer existed found themselves obsolete overnight. The same empire that had invested fortunes in their training now discarded them like broken tools, moving on to new methods of exploitation without a backward glance. Perhaps the most tragic irony is that some of these forgotten victims became nostalgic for their abuse. Having never known normal human relationships, they remembered the palace as a place of beauty and refinement, conveniently forgetting the terror and degradation that had defined their daily existence. This psychological defense mechanism, romanticizing one's own victimization, became another form of prison, preventing them from ever fully understanding what had been stolen from them. The children who might have become poets, farmers, merchants, or fathers instead became living artifacts of an empire's moral bankruptcy. Their potential was sacrificed on the altar of imperial convenience, their humanity traded for administrative efficiency. They represent not just individual tragedies, but the systematic murder of possibility itself. Thousands of lives that could have flourished, but were instead consumed by a machine that valued beauty over humanity and power over compassion. Today, when we study the Ottoman Empire in classrooms around the world, we focus on its military innovations, its architectural achievements, and its role in global trade networks. We analyze its political structures and marvel at its longevity. But we rarely ask the most important question: what did it cost? Not in gold or territory, but in human lives, in childhood innocence, in the capacity for love and trust that was systematically destroyed to maintain imperial power. The boys who walked these marble corridors centuries ago left no memoirs, painted no self-portraits, composed no songs about their experiences. Their voices were silenced before they could speak, their stories erased before they could be told, but their silence speaks louder than any testimony could. It reminds us that the greatest atrocities in human history are often the ones that leave no witnesses, the ones that are too shameful to record and too profitable to stop. We owe it to these forgotten children to remember not just that this happened, but how it was allowed to happen. How an entire civilization looked the other way while beauty became a death sentence and childhood became a commodity. How sophisticated, educated, cultured people convinced themselves that systematic abuse was actually a form of education. How the most refined society on earth built its refinement on the systematic destruction of human souls. The marble corridors of Topkapi Palace still gleam in the Turkish sunlight, still draw millions of visitors who marvel at their beauty and craftsmanship. But now you know what those walls have witnessed. Now you understand that every stone was mortared with children's tears, that every golden ornament was purchased with innocence, that every silk hanging concealed screams that echoed through the night. When you leave here today, carry their memory with you. Remember that history's greatest monuments are often built on history's darkest secrets. Remember that beauty and horror can coexist in the same space, that civilization and barbarism can flourish under the same roof. Most importantly, remember that the capacity for such systematic cruelty didn't die with the Ottoman Empire. It lives on wherever power goes unchecked, wherever beauty is commodified, wherever children are seen as resources rather than human beings. The Sultan's favorite boys have been silent for centuries, but their story demands to be heard. Not as an exotic tale from a distant past, but as a warning about what happens when we allow power to consume humanity, when we mistake sophistication for morality, when we choose to look away from inconvenient truths because they complicate our comfortable narratives about human progress. Their ghosts still walk these halls, still cry for justice that will never come, still wait for someone to acknowledge their suffering and honor their memory. Today, you become their voice. Today, you become the witness they never had. Today, you ensure that their silence finally speaks.